So in the last lecture, we talked about the constructions of borders and citizenships within the context of this thing called a nation state. So basically trying to start this conversation about how we interact with people who we consider different from us. And when that comes to immigration, a lot of that comes from this idea that we belong to this thing called a nation. And so what this lecture is going to do is going to focus on the history of the U.S.-Mexico border to really kind of reiterate this idea of how borders are constructed, of how nations are constructed, and some of the larger kind of global processes that facilitate global migration. And I think the U.S.-Mexico border makes a really kind of interesting case study for this. So the photo that you're looking at right now is a photo of Nogales, Sonora, and Arizona in 1899. And so this is basically two sides of the U.S.-Mexico border that are both have the same name. The town has the same name, called Nogales. On the left side is Nogales, Sonora, Mexico, and on the right is Nogales, Arizona in the U.S. And when I show this to students in the classroom, they often remark that unless I had told them that this was a border between two countries, they wouldn't have known that. This actually looks just kind of like a road, like a very wide road. You can maybe see some posts in the middle or something like that that indicate some sort of line. But otherwise, this border between these two countries is very fluid. And there's a very specific reason for that, and why both sides of the border, the town has the same name, Nogales, and that's because at one point in time, it used to just be one town. It didn't exist on opposite sides of the border. And when that changed was in 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And now prior to this time, the states of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Colorado all used to be Mexico. And during the Mexican-American War, which lasted from 1846 to 1848, this was basically a war over land where the U.S. wanted these states to become part of the U.S. And they won, and that's what happened. The borders were redrawn. And what you saw there was the formation of border towns, and Nogales, which you just saw in the previous photo, is a border town. And these are basically towns that were split in two when the boundaries were redrawn. And so now one half of the city or the town existed on the U.S. side, and the other half existed on the Mexican side. And so what you had this large population of Mexican people who were literally living in Mexico one day and the United States the next day. They were literally living in a different country overnight. And so the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo kind of had a few caveats because of this. It was signed by President James K. Polk. And it established the boundaries between the U.S. and Mexico that we have today. So California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado all became part of the United States. But there was also this other very important caveat, and that was that because you had this entire group of people who were suddenly living in a different country, they would not be expected to give up their language or culture. So I'm going to repeat that. We have a treaty with Mexico that protects Mexican people's right to their language and to their culture. Because there was this understanding that just because they were living in a new nation didn't mean that they would feel like they were living in a new nation, especially when this had been their home for so long. And so the Treaty of Guadalupe, while it redrew the lines between borders, also recognized that Mexican people's presence on this land predated those borders. And so there was provisions to protect their language and culture. And also during this time, migration was something that was what's called circular migration. And so that's why the border in that photo kind of looked the way that it did. People moved back and forth pretty easily between the borders, partly because their families were separated when the lines were redrawn, but also because the United States kind of had immigration policies that would bring Mexican workers in during economic downturn. And so what you had were people would come into the United States for largely seasonal work and then go back to Mexico after it was completed. So seasonal work would be something like seasonal agricultural work, like apple season or something like that. And so people living in border towns and also other parts of Mexico too would cross the U.S.-Mexico border pretty easily during this time. We had a border patrol, but it was pretty small. And the United States basically utilized work programs to suit their economic needs. And probably the biggest example of this was the Bracero program, which lasted from 1942 to 1964. And so basically what this did was that it brought workers in to Mexico for agricultural work. However, it was problematic for several reasons. One is that the workers worked under very poor conditions for very little pay. And they were sent back to Mexico when they were no longer needed, regardless of how long they had lived there. And many people who participated in this program had lived there for a significant amount of time, having developed families, had really established roots there because the Bracero program allowed them to stay in the country for a significant amount of time. And when it ended, it really didn't take that into account, and many of these workers were deported back to the United States. And it really kind of goes to show how during this time, migration was seen as being in the economic interests of the U.S. at the time. That started to shift, however, in the 1970s to the 1990s, where immigration starts to become constructed as a threat. And there are a few reasons for this. One, in 1963-94, we have the passage of the Civil Rights Acts, and these basically opened up public resources to people of color. So things like public assistance and food stamps, welfare, programs like that were now open to people of color when they hadn't been before. And then you also have a 1970s economic recession and this kind of desire to stimulate economic growth. And as we talked about before, neoliberalism was emerging as an economic policy and philosophy at this time. And when all of these things came together, basically what happened was immigration came to be constructed as a threat. It gave the public someone to blame for the economic recession, but it also maintained an exploitable labor force. So we still utilized Mexican workers as cheap labor, but the discourse around them changed, and it actually made them even more exploitable. And how that really kind of came in was the Immigration Control and Reform Act of 1986, which was signed by Reagan, and that photo on the left is actually of Reagan signing this act. And it did kind of two kind of contradictory things. It made it illegal for people to work without documentation in the United States, but it also created a pathway to citizenship for undocumented people who had been in the country since before 1982, but they had to admit to guilt, and they had to pay a fine, and they had to pay back taxes, and they were also barred from public assistance for 5 years on their pathway to citizenship. So it was this idea of opening up our doors to immigrant communities, but also made them very vulnerable. They had no access to a social safety net and were very exposed as undocumented people, and it actually made them made it easier for employers to exploit their labor. And so this kind of carried on into the 1990s when we had what was called deterrence models of immigration. And so this kind of carried, the Clinton administration really kind of carried this forward. And what we saw in the 1990s was an increase in border security along the U.S.-Mexico border. We created blockages in the safest places to cross. So programs like Operation Gatekeeper and Operation Hold the Line increased the number of Border Patrol officers and concentrated them at the parts of the border that were the safest to cross. So basically people now had to cross the most dangerous parts of the desert in order to make it into the United States, which they did. Even though it was now, and this was a kind of an interesting paradox, even though it was now harder to cross the border, we were at the same time enacting policies that forced people to migrate from Mexico into the United States. And probably the biggest example of this was the North American Free Trade Agreement of 1994, also known as NAFTA. And this was a free trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And so basically it reduced or eliminated barriers to trade, so like tariffs or any other taxes that would make it harder for, say, the US to export its goods to other countries like Canada and Mexico. And what the United States did is it engaged in a practice known as corn dumping. And it sold corn in Mexico at a cost of what it was cheaper than what it cost to produce. So basically flooded the Mexican market with corn. And not only is corn a staple in US and Mexican food cultures, but it basically put Mexican farmers out of business because they weren't able to compete with that. So what you have is this large population of people who suddenly cannot afford to live in their home countries anymore. And they started moving into the United States en masse in search of low-wage service labor so that they can send that money back to their families in Mexico. So not only is the U.S. benefiting by this reduced barriers to their exports, but now the U.S. has a surplus of low-wage labor from the people who were kind of put out of business in their home countries now moving into the United States. This really intensified after 2001 with the war on terror. And so a lot of kind of changes happened here where this enforcement of the border really became even more intensified. The Bush administration really kind of created these links between immigration and terrorism. And in 2003, Immigration and Naturalization Services, which is what the immigration agency was called before, becomes Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement, ICE. It moves from the Department of Justice to the Department of Homeland Security. And it was basically a coupling of deterrence models of border policy with fears of terrorism that just kind of came together in our immigration policy. And this had three kind of overall major impacts. We saw substantial increases in hiring of Border Patrol officers, criminalization of migration and a surge in deportations, and construction of substantial border infrastructure, so fortified walls and motion detector and night vision equipment. The border became very militarized. And this photo is of the same border from 1899, and this is what it looked like in 2007. You can see that there's police cars, there's more fortified wall, there's fencing that leans over towards the Mexican side of the border. It looks very starkly different from what it did when the lines between US and Mexico were redrawn. And there's a very specific reason for this. And so Grace Chang, in her book Disposable Domestics, really kind of documented this. And she observed two contradictory things about immigration and economic policy in the U.S. First, there was this idea that deterrence models of immigration policy were making it harder to enter the U.S. and were taking human rights away once undocumented workers arrived. So we're having policies that want to keep them out. However, we're having economic policies like NAFTA that are forcing people to come into the United States. And what her central argument is that the purpose of current immigration policy is actually not to keep undocumented workers out, but is actually to keep them in. Because like I said, with NAFTA, with this influx of low-wage labor, that's created what's called a surplus of low-wage disposable labor. We have more workers than there are jobs. And so what ends up happening is that if a person who is in this kind of surplus low-wage labor has an issue with their employer, they really can't complain because they're, quote, disposable. They can easily be replaced. So what immigration policy does is it does not keep undocumented people out, it keeps them in and creates an exploitable labor force. And so really what immigration policy is a neoliberal project. It's a kind of a wealth accumulation for the economic elites. So thank you for making it to the end. If you have any questions about any of this or would like further reading or further details, please feel free to let me know. Thank you.